Thank you very much. And welcome to the Bork Roundtable. I'm very excited for this next program, which is extremely timely, although sadly it would be timely at any point in time in recent history. But I want to begin by welcoming the Bork family members who are with us this morning. Bob Bork, Diana Bork, Claire Bork, and Mary Ellen Bork. Thank you for joining us. I would also, if you'll indulge me, like to make a very brief personal announcement, and that is that today is my wedding anniversary. So kudos. I'm going to assume that applause was for my wife. How many years? We've been together 27 years. Got married in the Mayflower Hotel in the Chinese Room, which is not why we're going back to the Mayflower. But I'm very pleased to introduce a good friend of the Federalist Society to kick off this year's Honorable Robert H. Bork Memorial Roundtable. That is United States Senator Ted Cruz. He asked me to be brief in my introduction of him so he would have more time to speak. But I do want to tell one story about him that I think is really instructive for today's event. And this took place in my office before he was a senator. He had a lot of energy in this conversation, which was just him and me in my office. And he began explaining his plans at that time, describing a sequence of events and predictions and things that had to happen that stretched out over nearly an entire year, that by January 31st, X will happen, and we'll do X by March 15th, and by April 15th, X will happen, and then a primary, and then a runoff, and then an election. And by the end of this discussion, he was behind my desk with my mouse on my computer, showing me things on the computer screen as helpful, visual aids to his plans. And I thought it was important to tell you that story as a demonstration of his incredible vision and his remarkable insights and foresights. And now, in this moment, today, his remarkable leadership on the topic we're about to discuss this morning. So with that, Senator Cruz.
Well, good morning, and Dean, happy anniversary. We're gathered here at a time of great consequence. In August 1790, President George Washington visited Newport, Rhode Island, and he received a letter from the Hebrew congregation there, one of the oldest Jewish communities in America. Washington wrote back with a message that captured the moral spirit of our fledgling republic. Washington assured the Hebrew congregation that our young and yet principled nation, quote, gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance. And he promised, quote, that the children of the stock of Abraham shall sit in safety under their own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make them afraid. Ours was a nation that was founded by those fleeing religious oppression, coming to start a new land where each and every American can seek out and worship the Lord God Almighty with all of your heart, mind, and soul, free of the government getting in the way. There is a reason religious liberty is the very first liberty and the very first clause of the First Amendment to the Constitution. Because without that right, every other right pales in comparison. That right applies to Christians, it applies to Jews, it applies to Muslims and Hindus. It applies to atheists. Each of us has the ability to make our own moral journey to seek out God Almighty and use the very best of our soul and our mind and our understanding in our relationship with our Creator. And indeed, America was started on an even more fundamental principle, which is that our rights, all of the rights that law exists to protect, originate not with government, but rather with God. There was a hearing a couple of months ago in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee where a nominee to the State Department had put in his written submission that our rights come from God and not government. And one of my colleagues, Senator Tim Kaine from Virginia, took issue with that statement. And he began upbraiding this nominee, and he said, the idea that our rights come from God and not government, he said, that is a radical idea. That is a dangerous idea. He said, that's the idea of a theocracy. That's what they do in Iran. That's not what we do in America. Now, I walked in as Senator Kaine was engaged in that diatribe. I had a whole different set of questions that I had planned to ask. I set those aside. And when it came my turn to speak, I revisited what Tim Kaine had said. I said, you know what? Senator Kaine said the idea that our rights come from God and not from government is a radical idea. He's right. It is. He said it's a dangerous idea. He's right again. It is. It is also quite literally the founding principle upon which our nation was founded. And I went on to say, if Senator Kaine is not inclined to believe me, perhaps he would believe another Virginian, one far more consequential than I could ever hope or aspire to be, who in the Declaration penned the immortal words, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Self-evident. Any blithering moron should be able to figure this out. That would be the modern commentary. That all men are created equal. That we are endowed by our Creator. Not by government, not by the DNC, not by the RNC, but by God Almighty with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That idea, our nation was born in a revolution of muskets and bayonets, but before that, a revolution of ideas. For millennia, mankind had been governed by kings and queens and monarchs who told the people they were ordained by God. They were the source of power, and power flowed from God to the monarch, to the people, and any right given to the people was given like crumbs from the table of the monarch. And if it can be given by whim, it can be taken away by whim. The revolution that preceded the firing of gunpowder and shot was a revolution of ideas. That no king has authority over our rights, that sovereignty, our nation, we inverted sovereignty. Sovereignty flows from God to we the people, and from we the people to those in elected office to whom we lend power. But the Constitution serves, as Jefferson also told us, as chains to bind the mischief of government. That then brings us to what we are seeing now with anti-Semitism. Because those fundamental principles of religious liberty, of equality, of rights that come from God Almighty, those are under assault today in a real and profound way. 10 years ago, we saw anti-Semitism begin to rise on the left, begin to rise on college campuses, begin to rise with radical professors corrupting the minds of young students. And we saw it begin to rise in the halls of Congress. And the leaders of the Democrat Party did nothing. They looked the other way. They said, this is a fringe view. It doesn't concern us. We don't need to worry about this. And in the decade that followed, tragically, it has consumed the Democrat Party. Today, there is a real and cognizable pro-Hamas wing of the Democrat Party, and the remainder of the Democrats are terrified of them. I have Democrat colleagues in the Senate who abhor what has happened to their party, but they are terrified to open their mouth and say a word about it. We saw the parade of supposedly mainstream Democrats rushing to New York City to endorse Comrade Mandami, an actual communist jihadist. And by the way, I was on ABC, and they said, jihadist, how can you say that? What do you think globalize the intifada means? Intifada, whatever. What do you think it means? When that happened on the left, those of us on the right were quite comfortable standing up and denouncing it. In some ways, that's easy. But now it's happening on the right. In the last 6 months, I've seen more anti-Semitism on the right than I have at any time in my life. It is growing. It is metastasizing. There are about a half dozen vocal apostles, and it is in particular finding purchase with the young. Look, I joined the Federalist Society 34 years ago when I was a 21-year-old 1L in law school. The Federalist Society has long been a forum for debate, a forum where people can disagree and disagree vigorously, but do so respectfully. The Federalist Society has also been a unifying force, bringing together conservatives, libertarians. One of my favorite questions, Judge Strauss, you'll appreciate this, that I would ask clerks coming to interview with Judge Ludig. So I'd say, tell me, what does the Ninth Amendment mean? And whatever they answered, one of my co-clerks was John Eastman, whatever they answered, either I or John would say, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. And frankly, the purpose of the question was not, the answer was not the purpose of the question. The purpose of the question is, let's see how you can dance. Let's see how you can defend your views. On the right, however, look, if you look in the last week, we saw one gathering down at Ole Miss where a student got up and asked the vice president a viciously anti-Israel question filled with lies. And here's what was most disturbing. When the questioner finished speaking, cheers erupted from the crowd. It wasn't everybody. My guess is it was 20 to 30% of the crowd. And listen, this was not Berkeley. This was not Yale. This is old friggin' Miss. Or just a couple of days ago down at Auburn, again, a student got up and asked a question unloading on Israel. That question, every single word was wrong, including and the and but. But again, look at the reaction of the students. About 30% cheered. And young people are being lied to. And by the way, one of the lies is, no, I'm not anti-Semitic. I don't dislike Jews. I just hate Israel. And one of the favorite shields is, I'm not anti-Semitic. I'm just anti-Zionist. It's really funny, the people who speak about Zionist. Somehow, they get very concerned at people being killed in Gaza. And yet, after President Trump negotiates a peace deal and Hamas lines Palestinians up and shoots them in the back of the head, executing them one after the other, those same voices are utterly silent because if it's Palestinians being murdered by Hamas terrorists, that's not a concern. Their only concern is if they can attack Israel and Jews for doing so. I think every one of us has an obligation to speak out. Listen, we've seen in the last year, Tucker Carlson in particular, spread a poison that is profoundly dangerous. When you invite a history professor onto your show, and you describe that history professor as the most important popular historian in America, and that history professor says Winston Churchill was the villain of World War II, and you nod adoringly while he says so. And that professor goes on to say, look, the Germans didn't mean to kill that many people. They just had a problem dealing with the Jewish question. When you invite another historian on, an economist, who says there's a very good argument the United States of America should have joined World War II and sided with the Nazis, and again, you nod adoringly. When you invite a little goose-stepping Nazi onto your show, someone who has said, and I quote, Hitler is right, Hitler is very, very cool, and I'm on Team Hitler, you would note those are statements that do not produce ambiguity. And to be clear, my complaint about Tucker having Nick Fuentes on was not that he platformed him. That's a choice you can make or not. But the last I checked, Tucker actually knows how to cross-examine someone. By the way, Judge, what's the population of Azerbaijan?
90,000.
If he wanted to have Nick Fuentes on and cross-examine him for his hateful, odious views, and by the way, they are odious about advocating rape of women, they're odious in every respect. If you want to cross-examine and challenge him, that's fine. But he didn't. He fawningly gazed at him, including when Mr. Fuentes said he loved Stalin and he celebrated Joseph Stalin's birthday every year. Now, what kind of freak job celebrates Stalin's birthday? Look, my family fled communism. My family was tortured in Cuba. Communism is the most evil and vile ideology the world has ever produced, and Joseph Stalin, I remember when I was in college, there was a kid down the hall who had a poster on his dorm room wall of Che Guevara. And I went into his room, and I'm like, hey, that is awesome. That is so cool. Have you thought of maybe putting Hitler next to it? Or maybe a Stalin or a Mao or a Pol Pot. I mean, look, if we're going to glorify people who murder and torture people, I mean, Che was an amateur. And I will tell you, it's easy right now to denounce Nick Fuentes. That's kind of safe. Are you willing to say Tucker's name? Now, I can tell you my colleagues almost to a person think what is happening is horrifying. But a great many of them are frightened because he has one hell of a big megaphone. I think every one of us has a moral obligation. I'll be very clear. I think Nazis are detestable pigs. I think Klansmen are detestable pigs. But let's go back to the topic of this panel. What is the First Amendment's relevance to it? They have every right to speak. I have defended and will defend the right of Nick Fuentes to say every piece of garbage he says. I have defended and will defend. I've defended Alex Jones, who's gone on the radio and accused my father repeatedly of killing JFK. By the way, I will tell you when that happened, Marco Rubio at the Senate lunch stood up and he said, listen, I can tell you for a fact that Ted's dad did not kill JFK. Because if a Cuban had done it, he would have told everybody. But my father calls me because he's having these shows describing how he assassinated a president. And my dad's like, this is terrible. I'm going to sue him. I'm like, Dad, don't sue Alex Jones. There's an old adage, when you wrestle with a pig, you get covered in mud and the pig likes it. Like there is no upside to suing this guy. But I have vocally defended his right to speak, even though I detest what he says. And I will also speak out against big tech censorship of these idiots. I had the CEO of YouTube sitting in my office a few years ago, and she was describing how Steven Crowder, YouTube, had lots of requests from the left to pull him off air. And they admitted he did nothing to violate their terms of service. And she said to me, you should be really proud of us because we didn't deplatform him. We simply demonetized him. And I looked at her and I said, I'm curious, how would YouTube feel if we simply demonetized you? Would that be a problem? And I said, I want you to understand this is not even-handed. Both sides are asking for this. It is only one side that is saying, silence my critics. I'm not asking you to keep Bernie Sanders and AOC off the air. In fact, I want you to put them on the air more because what they're saying is ridiculous. Frankly, I wanted to pay for a national bus tour to put Kamala Harris in every community in America. But it's only one side that is calling for silencing those they disagree with. But understand this as well. The government cannot criminalize hateful, noxious, horrible speech. And indeed, the First Amendment exists for hateful, noxious, horrible speech. It doesn't exist for speech that's popular. You don't need a First Amendment if everyone agrees with you. You only need a First Amendment when those in power disagree with you. But the fact that the government cannot punish you, and the fact that, as I believe, tech platforms should not be able to censor you, does not mean suddenly all of us are absolved of any moral responsibility. Fuentes and Tucker and the rest of that ilk have a right to say what they are saying, but every one of us has an obligation to stand up and say it is wrong. A long time ago, when Robert Bork was a young man before I was born, Ronald Reagan gave a speech to the country describing that it was a time for choosing. I believe now, today, is a time for choosing as well. I think it is a time for every elected official. I think it is a time for every editorialist. I think it is a time for every lawyer, for every student to decide, where do you stand? As for me, and I'm confident as for the men and women of the Federalist Society, we will stand for liberty, we will stand for the Constitution, we will stand for the Bill of Rights, but we will also stand for truth, and we will call out lies where they occur, and we will call out hatred when they occur, and the best antidote to lies is truth. The best solution to darkness is light. And each of us, I believe, have been put in this place for such a time as this. And I'm proud to stand for each and every one of you to defend the principles upon which the greatest nation in the history of the world was founded. Thank you. Thank you very, very much.
That was amazing. Thank you, Senator. All right, so we got about 14 minutes left for 10 federal judges to say their piece. All right, I think now we're going to play a short video, which will leave us with about 7 minutes, about Robert Bork's legacy in this space. Let's play the video.
During the late 1950s, the period when Robert Bork and I were employed in the Kirkland firm in Chicago, I observed that the pattern of employment among large firms in that city was for Jewish law graduates to be employed by Jewish firms and for non-Jewish graduates to be employed by non-Jewish firms. The Kirkland firm was part of that pattern. In the early months of 1957, my classmate Howard G. Crane, who was Jewish, was interviewed by the Kirkland firm. Considered on his merits, Crane would clearly have received an offer. He was a top graduate with law review experience, and he showed every promise of being an outstanding lawyer. Despite this, he was brushed off and not offered employment because he was Jewish. When Bork learned about Crane's rejection, he was incensed. Even though only an associate, without any formal voice in the hiring decisions of the firm, Bork determined to try to use the case of Howard Crane to change the firm's practice of excluding Jewish graduates from employment. Bork went to the hiring partners of the law firm and took a strong position that their failure to hire Crane because he was Jewish was not only extremely short-sighted for a firm that was interested in top talent, it was also deeply offensive to some young lawyers the firm was obviously grooming for future leadership. Today, Crane is a managing partner of that firm, Kirkland Ellis, one of the nation's most prestigious.
I am the lawyer who, as a young man, was the immediate beneficiary of Bob Bork's insistence to the senior partners of my law firm that it eliminate prejudice and discrimination from its hiring practice in 1957. Bork is a person without prejudice against any group.
All right, we're going to get right to it, and we like to make Justice Evan Young feel welcome among all the life tenure judges, so
Thank you.
we're going to start with him. Evan, you're differently situated than everybody here in the sense that you're an elected official, and you spent your career really as a lawyer advocating for religious freedom and religious tolerance, and you went to Iraq and you saw the way that sectarian violence really tore that country apart. Talk to us a little bit about why, in Senator Cruz's words, religious freedom, religious tolerance, religious exercise are so important to you as a lawyer and as a judge.
Well, thank you, Judge Altman. I'm honored to be here on this panel. There's a few topics that matter more to my wife and me than the one that you have assembled us to talk about. And I'm very pleased to represent with this group of many, many federal judges the entirety of the state judicial systems right here. And so I'm pleased with the allocation of time. The state judiciary will get half, and the federal judiciary. As a citizen, I care deeply about our civic tradition of religious respect, without which a free society cannot exist. And I am convinced that that tradition, that commitment by President Washington by our founding fathers, by our people, is one that played an enormous role in making our country what it is today. I don't think we would remotely look like what we look like today without it. As a Christian, I think that religious liberty and mutual respect are essential so that every man and woman can follow God and be answerable to God without burdens being cast upon them by other men. As a lawyer, I was convinced that our profession could be a source of great good for our entire country, not just for those who are personally motivated by religion, but that our profession could do great things for everyone by helping clients of any faith who had genuine religious liberty claims to make their cases to the courts in the clearest, strongest way possible. As a teacher, I thought that arming the coming generation of lawyers with a systematic understanding of the constitutional and historical foundations of American religious liberty could not help but to increase those students' respect, not just for that topic, but for the Constitution as a whole. And I loved co-teaching the religious liberty class at the University of Texas School of Law with my friend Hiram Sasser. And now, as a judge, I am deeply concerned about any looming threat to the rule of law, to the promise of true self-governance, including by the creeping and sometimes increasingly and astonishingly open depredations of whole groups of our fellow citizens based upon their religious traditions, and especially right now for our Jewish brothers and sisters. And when I grew up, as I think was true for most of you in this room, maybe not for the youngest, the students in this room, there were plenty of times where you'd hear somebody say something like, well, the Holocaust didn't really exist, or, oh, Hitler was great, and we would hear these things, and then we would instantly say, now I don't need to listen to anything else that person has to say. Not that we were canceling them, but we were triaging. There are only 24 hours in a day. We have to extract the value that we can from as much of it as possible. And when someone is willing to tell you that their judgment is terrible, believe them. But now we're not in that situation. Now we have people insisting on the rest of us listening. And if we don't, then we're accused of canceling. And it's not just listening, it's listening to things that are attempting to invoke power to harm our Jewish brothers and sisters based upon that very fundamental part of their identity in the United States of America. And these signs of cancer in our republic are, I think, a threat to the rule of law. They're not just bad, but they are bad, but they're more than that. Now, the rule of law is a term that is starting, I fear, to lose some of its meaning. It's tossed out so frequently these days by so many people, and what they often mean by it, they use it sometimes as an epithet. Well, here is what I think, and if you don't do what I say, then you are harming the rule of law. Or here's what I think the law is, and unless you want to destroy the rule of law, you'd better do what I think. But stripped of any tendentious political weight, the rule of law at its core means that there are predictable and neutral legal principles that will be applied fairly to resolve and ideally to prevent legal disputes. Even if one doesn't care about respect for our fellow citizens' religious traditions for its own sake, then, and I think everyone should care about that respect for its own sake, but even if you don't, religious tolerance is an essential ingredient for basic things like a free and thriving economy. And you can see how religious prejudice, this depredation, this predatory attack on people based upon their religious identification, how that can undermine the core values of the rule of law itself. And the time I spent in Iraq, I thought, illustrated that point to me long ago. Imagine somebody with just a little bit of money back in Iraq during the time of the surge when I was there, willing to pool that money with others who have just a little bit of money in order to be able to start a small business, say a neighborhood bakery. And if you multiply that out across the land of Iraq, this beleaguered country, that would be one valuable, powerful way to help exit from the misery that the people of that land were suffering. It would spur economic growth. It would put money in people's pockets. It would improve the quality of life, diminish the sense of deprivation, reduce the attraction of governance by terrorists, increase interest in broader governmental participation because now we have a real stake, a virtuous circle of immense proportion. And I don't mean to oversimplify anything, and of course it's true that there were many, many barriers to economic, social, civil development. But one of the most serious was that religious division infiltrated the way that people were treated by their government. Aligning that with political division made people very wary of making a $50 investment in the neighborhood bakery. Because if things went wrong, if you had a dispute with your fellow owners, what would happen when you go to court? If your vindication would turn, or really more importantly, if you perceived that your vindication would turn on which branch of Islam you were an adherent of, or whether your brother-in-law was powerfully aligned with the party in power there, or whether you came from a family that was politically disfavored, or whatever else, well, you're just not going to make the investment. The religious component of it was a huge part of that winners and losers would be chosen based not on their shared obligations as citizens, but based on other criteria, which meant that it was harder for them to forge the civic brotherhood that is essential for a country's people to be able to walk arm in arm into the future, aiming to improve the lot of successive generations. And so it makes me sad to see this rising anti-Semitism in our country today. And I think I probably speak for a lot of people in this room, honestly, who, if you had asked us on October 6th, 2023, we would have said that anti-Semitism is basically behind us in this country. October 7th changed everything, not because of what happened in Israel, but because of what happened in America. And I'll never make the mistake again of thinking that we are done with anti-Semitism. And so in 1790, Senator Cruz referenced what we all know about the beautiful letter, short letter, go read it if you haven't read it for a while, to the Truro Synagogue. And he said this about our country: the citizens of the United States of America have a right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind examples of an enlarged and liberal policy, a policy worthy of imitation. All possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. And that's why I am so honored to be part of this panel talking about this topic, because I think that we all, as citizens, lawyers, teachers, judges, and adherents of our own various faith traditions, owe it to the future in our country to do what we can today to ensure that the American promise of religious respect that George Washington wrote of 235 years ago not only doesn't slide backward, but continues to be a light shining brightly for the entire rest of the world.
Amen. We could probably wrap up after that, but we'll hear from the others. Judge Rudofsky, you've spent a lot along that theme. You've spent a lot of time researching the founding period, and in particular the contributions of Jewish men and women to the founding and the revolution. And when we look back at American history, we see that even as late as leaders like Abraham Lincoln really believed that America was an extension of the biblical promise of Israel. He called us an almost chosen people. Talk to us a little bit about what you've learned in that journey.
So, at the risk of sounding a little bit too rabbinic, I'm going to answer your question with a story. How many of you here have heard the story of Chaim Solomon? If you have, raise your hand. So that's good. There are not a lot of people other than Roy, and I think that's appropriate. So Chaim was a Jew born in either Western Poland or Eastern Russia in the 1740s. He found his way to New York alone in the 1770s. He came to America to escape persecution in large part, and also because he had read letters from other Jews who were already in the United States, explaining just how rich in liberty, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, and opportunity America was. And when he came to New York, he set up a very successful brokerage firm. He did very, very well for himself. He married the love of his life, and they had a child together. And then when the British invaded New York, Chaim was thrown in jail because he had supported or was supporting the colonial rebels. Eventually, Chaim escaped, but not before both he was sentenced to death, although obviously not executed, and he got very, very sick from tuberculosis, and he lost his entire fortune. That probably would have stopped anybody else. It did not stop Chaim. So Chaim Solomon then went to Philadelphia, started a new brokerage firm, earned a sort of another substantial fortune, and then proceeded, despite being terribly sick from tuberculosis, proceeded to work himself to the bone and spend his entire fortune bankrolling the American Revolution. He supported financially a huge number of the members of the Continental Congress, including Madison on several occasions. He raised funds, a huge amount of funds for soldiers, for their pay, for their equipment. He guaranteed and endorsed a huge number of notes from the American government, and also he was essentially the French's money manager in the States or in America. And he did all of this for the most part without taking any kind of fees or interest or salary. And when he did take a fee or interest or salary, he immediately sort of put it back into helping the revolutionary cause. He died fairly young. I think he died in the middle of the 1780s, maybe a little bit later. He was in his 40s. He died completely destitute, penniless, being owed about $600,000 from the American government and from folks privately who were, in our founding generation. I tell you this story because I think it is part of a very, very long tradition of Jews giving everything they've got and loving this country with as much as they can and doing things for this country. And that, of course, raises the question, why? Why did Jews come here? And when they came here, why did they do everything they possibly could for this country? And my sense is that the answer to this is the Christian values of this country. I don't think they did it in spite of those values. I think they did it because of those values. And what I'm talking about here are the values that I think were forged over decades, if not centuries, of Christian strife and persecution of sort of various different sects in England and really in greater Europe. And I think that experience forged a particularly American Christianity. If you'll let me, I'm going to stitch together two of de Tocqueville's observations from Democracy in America. He said, "The Americans combine the notions of Christianity and of liberty so intimately in their minds that it is impossible to make them conceive of one without the other." And then he also said, in a slightly different context, "There's an innumerable multitude of sects in the United States. All differ in worship one must render to the Creator, but all agree on the duties of men towards one another." And I think that was the sort of secret sauce of America. To be fair, of course, we know in colonial times, in early American history, and even today, things aren't always so rosy as the ideal or the perception. But nonetheless, that ideal and the perception is important because perception often ends up becoming reality. And so, at least to my mind, the through line in American history for Jews here has always been an understanding that in every generation there are the overwhelming majority of Christians are dedicated to ensuring the values that Senator Cruz spoke about and that my good friend Justice Young spoke about. Of course, every once in a while, anti-Semitism or religious persecution of other minorities rears its ugly head. But we have been very lucky in this country that so far, every time that has happened, a large number, an incredibly large number of Christians have stood up to stand with us and with other religious minorities to turn back the tide of persecution. And I'll just say, for me, I thank God for that, and I thank God for those people, and that certainly includes Bob Bork. I will close with something from Calvin Coolidge. If you haven't read Calvin Coolidge's speech in 1925 at the laying of the cornerstone of the Washington Jewish Community Center, you should read it. It's a fantastic speech. I'm just going to end with one part. So, he says, "It is easy to understand why a people with the historic background of the Jews should thus overwhelmingly have allied themselves with the cause of freedom. From earliest colonial times, America has been a land of promises to this long persecuted race. They have always come to us, eager to adapt themselves to our institutions, to thrive under the influence of liberty, to take their full part as citizens in building and sustaining the nation, and to bear their part in its defense, in order to make contribution to the national life fully worthy of the traditions they inherited as a Jewish faith, predominantly being the faith of liberty." I think he's right, and I think it is the same faith of liberty that American Christians have and have had since the beginning. And so I want to say thank you to all of my colleagues for standing up here with me as well.
Amen. I was going to ask the next question of Judge Grunder, but I know what you're all thinking. I have this predilection for leaning to the right, so I'm just going to turn around and ask Judge Oldham. Judge Oldham, you're a Christian, you're a proud Christian, you're a proud American. When you were asked after October the 7th to go on one of these federal judges' trips to Israel, and by the way, state Supreme Court justices' trips are coming, don't feel discriminated against. You jumped at the opportunity and you went in the middle of rocket fire and warfare, and you've stood up in your community and around the country against the evil scourge of anti-Semitism. Talk to us about why you did that.
Thank you, Judge Altman, and it's a great honor to be here and to be on the stage with so many of my friends and to talk about a topic that I'm very passionate about. I guess I would try to get at this question in three different ways. I'll talk a little bit about personal background, a little bit about my trip to Israel, and then a little bit about what I see back home and how disturbing that is. So on a personal level, Judge Rudofsky is exactly right. My family came here as part of that great exodus that came out of religious persecution and settled in Massachusetts as part of the great American experiment in religious tolerance. And in fact, one of my ancestors, Jack Oldham, was expelled from the Massachusetts Bay Colony in part over religious factionism. So it's both right that is the great promise of the American pre-founding experience, and also that it was not perfect in any way. There were absolutely flaws in it, but it is something that is deeply woven into my family history, and in particular in World War II. So both of my grandfathers fought in that war on behalf of this great country to rid the world of the evils of the Nazi regime and Imperial Japan. And the way I was raised, there was absolutely no moral ambiguity in that at all. And it was not just World War II. Winston Churchill, in his first election to Parliament in the by-election of 1899, ran from the town of Oldham, England, and served the people of Oldham, England from 1900 to 1905. And this was part of the way that I was raised to understand both how that war happened, the evil that it was designed to rid the world of, and the role that my family had played a part in. And so when the modern nation of Israel was founded in the wake of that war, it was something that was deeply personal to us. I had the great privilege of going to law school with Judge Rudofsky, and I remember many of our conversations in law school about religious pluralism and what it meant to be in America. In fact, one of our section mates was born in a Palestinian refugee camp, and we remember these conversations. It seems quaint 20-something years later. It's sort of hard to imagine what these conversations would look like today, but back then, we were able to sit and talk and learn and debate. I mean, we obviously did not agree on everything. Lots of things that are really important to disagree about, but to disagree about agreeably, and more important than any of that, to really learn from one another. And Judge Altman, you're totally correct. My Christian faith is the central tenet of my identity on this earth. And it has been since I was a little boy, and it has grown and grown and grown every single year. And I see that the central piece of all of that is in the Holy Land. So when I had a chance to go, I will admit that part of what I wanted to see was I wanted to see in the post-October 7th world what Israel was like. But I also wanted to see the Holy Land. Right? I wanted to see the Sea of Galilee. I wanted to see Bethlehem, and I wanted to see Jerusalem. And when I went, there were two things that I was really struck by. One is the Israeli people standing up against one of the most horrific, violent, barbaric attacks that we have seen in modern time, and talking to people who had survived it, talking to the family members of who were then had hostages that were still under captive rule. I wanted to see that and talk and learn. But the other thing I was really struck by in my trip there was, like, if you go to the Western Wall and you see Orthodox Jews next to Muslims, yes, of course, the area is ridden with strife, and I'm not suggesting this is some kind of like kumbaya thing, but they are together in the same place, worshiping in a pluralistic way, and obviously worshiping in different ways, but worshiping in some form of coexistence. And that, I guess, this is the last thing I'll say and conclude on, is that is what I was so struck by, in particular on America's college campuses. And I just find, I don't see this as the anti-Semitism problem in this country, I don't see as a right-left issue. I see it as a good-bad issue, as a good versus evil issue. And hating somebody because of the God that they worship, or the way that they worship, or the people that they worship with, or who their parents are, is the most anti-American thing I can possibly imagine. And to see these college campuses where people are so filled with such hate and such illiberal intolerance is so scary, because these are this is the future. The future of our country are the young people. And it's the sort of thing that I think we have to identify, we have to speak out against, we have to recognize for what it is, and we have to have an absolute moral clarity in the way that we talk about it, because it's very scary. We have seen where it goes if we're not quite clear about it. And so I'd like to do my small part.
Thank you, Judge Oldham. Judge Packold, Israel spends so much energy and cares a great deal about preserving the Christian heritage sites in the country, and Judge Oldham just talked a little bit about that. And one of the things that we spend a lot of time doing when we go on our judges' trips to Israel is, of course, to visit some of those sites. And they're actually the most visited sites in the entire country, other than the Western Wall, every year. At least that was true before October the 7th. And we were on our last judges' trip, and we had what, as a Jewish person, I can say was incredibly meaningful, spiritual Ash Wednesday experience that frankly could only have happened in the Holy Land. You know, Ben Gurion used to say, in order to be a realist in Israel, you have to believe in miracles. And there were miracles that played out that day, and I know that you're Catholic and that that's an important part of your faith. And I wonder if you could just share the story of what happened that Ash Wednesday.
Sure, and thank you so much, Judge Altman, and for everybody being here. It was an incredible experience that day. So I went on the trip that was in March this year, and it happened to be Ash Wednesday, that Wednesday, that week. And we had a very packed schedule. Every day we were rushing. The schedule was just jammed, going from place to place, and it was incredibly, it was an unbelievable experience, just all the people that we got to meet and the places that we got to see. But Ash Wednesday, that's an important thing to me as a Catholic and as a Christian. And so I and some of the other judges on the trip were hoping to be able to go to Ash Wednesday Mass, Ash Wednesday service. And that day, as with many others, it was a packed schedule. And we started off in the north, in the Golan Heights. We visited a Druze village. Our very gracious guide was also keeping us on a very tight schedule, and as Roy mentioned, the Israelis were yelling at us, and so we were really kind of short on time, and so we were trying to make it. We had finished these different meetings and visits in the north, and we were heading back to Caesarea on the kind of southwest. And so in order to do that, we had to cross or go around the Sea of Galilee, which, of course, if anybody's been there, that's so important as a Catholic and as a Christian. It has some of the most incredible Christian sites. And so by this time, I think it was the afternoon, and thanks to Judge Altman, who was calling, he went on his phone, looked for churches around there.
I just typed in church, Sea of Galilee. And would you know, like 30 popped up.
Yes. And then called, right? I mean, so, because we were running behind. It was just a very last minute thing that very thankfully came together. And so Judge Altman managed to get hold of a Franciscan priest who was as you may know, the Franciscans are the caretakers of many of the Catholic sites there in the Holy Land. And so there was a Franciscan priest who was at the Church of the Primacy of Peter, which is right on the shore of the Sea of Galilee in a beautiful place, Tabgha. And it also happened to be a great stop. It just happened to work out. We were able to have an Ash Wednesday Mass right there on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. A lot of the Christian judges in our group were able to go into the Sea of Galilee.
Into the Sea of Galilee, all the judges went, you know. And the priest came out. He was like, "Judge, you know, get them out of the sea." I'm like, "Let the judges play in the sea," you know.
And the priest also said that he had actually been about to leave because it was in the afternoon. It was kind of getting towards the end of the day. His superior had actually told him, "Okay, fine, time to go home." And then he just got Judge Altman's call and heard, there's a bus of federal judges that need an Ash Wednesday Mass. So that too was very providential, and this whole experience, just getting to be part of a Mass on the actual Sea of Galilee, and that particular spot too, the Church of the Primacy of Peter, it's right below the Mount of the Beatitudes. It's absolutely beautiful. The Mount of the Beatitudes, of course, where the Sermon on the Mount was, and it also, that particular spot of that church, it's a famous gospel story from John 21, where there was a miraculous catch of fish. There was Jesus held a meal, breakfast with fish and bread, and then was able to also told St. Peter, or asked Peter, "Do you love me?" 3 times, which mirrors the 3 denials of Peter. So it's a very rich place theologically for Catholics, and so it was the entire experience was incredibly rich. I do think it was providential and very moving, and it was just a miraculous experience. And I'm so grateful to Roy and to our Jewish friends who were able to make that happen. And that was just I can't think of a better or more concrete example of the mutual respect and understanding. So thank you, Roy.
Thank you, Martha. what happened was I was in the back of the bus and I called the first church that popped up, Church of the Primacy of Peter. So I pick up the phone and the priest goes, "Praise the Lord." So I say, "Why praise the Lord?" And he goes, "Because like 15 minutes ago, my supervising priest told me, hey, it's the afternoon, nobody's coming back, just go home." And he said, "You know what, I have a premonition that I should stay 15 or 20 more minutes. And then you called with 20 federal judges from America who need an Ash Wednesday service." So I said, "Praise the Lord." Judge Grunder, when I called you to invite you to come on this trip, you said two things. You said, first, can I bring my wife? Which, I mean, I'm not saying, but she's here. You're probably the only judge who's ever asked me that, which means that you love your wife more than the rest of us do. I don't know. Or, I mean, on the other hand, it was a war zone, so. Sarah Isker, not happy with that joke. Buy her book, by the way, buy her book. But you also said it was a bucket list item. And I want to hear about why you and your wife thought it was a bucket list item for you. But I also want you to talk about one other thing, because we got plenty of time, you know. Two of our judges that went on our trip, I think Judge Nelson and Judge Solemson, had gone to Harvard Law School and had talked about their trip. And a couple of the students wearing the terrorism scarves, you've seen them, they came up and said, none of that happened on October 7th. It's all Zionist propaganda. Hamas doesn't kill women and children. And you and I, we went to the communities in the South. We watched the 47-minute horror video of the atrocities. I know it's painful and hard, but I'd like you to talk about what you saw, what you witnessed firsthand as well.
Well, I'd like to begin by thanking you, Judge Altman and Judge Radofsky and the World Jewish Congress, for giving Kim and I the opportunity to participate in the mission. And I'd like to thank the Federalist Society for giving me the opportunity to share a few thoughts about that with you. If you don't mind, I'll take your second question first.
I don't mind.
With my German heritage, as a child, I became very interested in World War II and read dozens of books, and that led me to an interest in the Holocaust, the Shoah, also reading dozens of books. As I got a little bit older and started to travel to Europe, every time I would go to Europe, I worked in a visit to a concentration camp or a death camp in some instances. The mission visited several places that were at least reminiscent of those. We went to the Kibbutz Kfar Aza. We walked around with survivors who told us about the atrocities that happened, walked from home to home, burned out, bullet-ridden buildings. We observed the safe rooms. Now, when I think of safe rooms, I think of the movies, and they're impenetrable. Well, that's not quite what the safe rooms were there. They were basically, how long can you hold the door with the terrorists pushing in or shooting through the door or burning your house down? At that particular kibbutz, 62 residents were killed, 19 were taken hostage. Many of the victims were beheaded, dismembered, and burned alive. The terrorists actually started with the first generation part of the kibbutz, where the families with young children lived. We then went to the Nahal Oz base, the military base. We saw the room and watched a video of young female IDF officers being rounded up and abused and later taken away as hostages and some killed. We went to a room where some dutiful IDF soldiers were watching their monitors, where I'm sure they were probably watching the invasion occur, and it just simply burned. I think they were all burned alive. 15 were killed there, and 15 civilians and 53 soldiers were killed. We then went to the Nova Music Festival, and we walked around amongst the memorials and pictures of 378 people, 344 civilians and 34 security personnel were killed. 44 were taken hostage. We then went to a mashav up near Gaza. Gaza was right in sight. And a survivor walked us around and told us about street battles and paragliders landing in their mashav. At least 17 people were killed. While doing that on the mission, I experienced a similar feeling to that I had at the concentration camps I visited. Standing in the very location where such tragedies have occurred, you really become aware of the brokenness of humanity. There's no way to describe how it feels to be in the ruins of Birkenau, knowing that 1 million people perished there. And similarly, there's no way to describe when you walk through the kibbutz or the mashav and think about the people who died there or who were taken hostage to live or die in a 4-foot tunnel. When I first started going to the concentration camps as a kid, I think what I was trying to discover is how could such an advanced society perpetrate such atrocities? And I didn't get an answer there, and I unfortunately didn't get the answer in Israel either, and maybe there just is no answer. But then we watched the 50-minute video, 47 minutes, that was taken by the Hamas terrorists themselves with GoPros and various things like that. Again, there's no way to describe the feeling that you're left with. And quite a feat followed that. For hours, there was stunned silence among a group of lawyers and judges, something that doesn't happen very often. And that evening, I'm very glad you allowed my wife, Kim, known as the mission physician, to be with me. It was nice to have somebody to support and console you after seeing that kind of horror. Turning to your first question, why was I drawn to this? As with others, I'm Roman Catholic, Jesuit educated, and the opportunity to see the Holy Land sites was certainly important. Israel is the home of the 3 large monotheistic religions, and it's just something not to be missed, despite a little trepidation about being in a war zone, I will admit. But the chance to walk in the footsteps of Christ on the Sea of Galilee, to visit the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, see the Mount of Olives, to see that these places are real, just like the concentration camps are real. C.S. Lewis, when he was a student of mythology, encountered the Gospels, but he was struck by how not mythological they are. Rather than once upon a time, events take place in the time of King Herod. Rather than in a galaxy far, far away, these events take place in Nazareth, Bethlehem, Jerusalem. So in Israel, the reality of the Gospels hit home for me. It was particularly moving to visit the holy sites within hours of the October 7 sites. It's easy to get weighed down by the tragedy and the horror of these events, and while it's important to remember that evil is real, my faith teaches me that evil will not prevail. And I think this lesson is important for lawyers. If you work in the criminal justice system, you see evil that humans perpetrate on each other all the time. And as a judge, we do our best to apply the law as it's given to us. But I think we recognize that perfect justice just is not achievable this side of heaven. Judge Bork once summarized his judicial philosophy with a Latin quotation from St. Thomas More's Utopia: "Strive to organize what cannot be perfect with as little harm as possible." I like this motto because it's descriptive. We are incapable of perfection, but it's also proscriptive. It points to humility, especially judicial humility, which is likely what attracted Judge Bork to originalism. I think it's good for all lawyers to remember we should try to do our best work to work toward a just society, but inevitably will fall short. While evil is real and sometimes overpowering, it ultimately will not win. This is what my faith teaches me, and my faith is why I wanted to visit Israel.
Thank you, Judge Grunder. Judge Tapar, I think one of the most pervasive and baseless claims about Israel is important to understand here in America, because I think it feeds a lot of the anti-Semitism here. And the claim is the same claim that we had back in the Middle Ages, that Jews relish in the killing of children and innocents. The claim that Israel is committing a genocide or has committed a genocide in Gaza. And it's important here in America for a variety of reasons, but one is when I go to college campuses and I talk to students about drawing swastikas on their fellow students' doors or wearing keffiyehs, which terrify their fellow Jewish students, they say, well, it's okay to do it to them because those students are supporting a genocide. So we can do anything to people who support a genocide. And so one of the things that I know you were really impacted by, and we've been on Sarah's podcast to talk about, look, she's on her phone, by the way, but
does that surprise you?
Sarah's podcast to talk about is that we actually got to go there. We got to meet with the lawyers who call the strikes on a daily basis. We got to see that there isn't a genocide.
They actually called off the strikes on a daily basis.
Why don't you talk to us about what we learned there?
Yeah, so thank you for having me. This is a really meaningful topic for me. I was someone that before October 7th thought of Israel and the Jewish people as the keepers of the Holy Land, and I'm grateful for that. But I didn't really think about or understand the history other than the Holocaust and the things you knew as a kid and learned as a kid and understood as a kid. And like my friend and colleague Andy Oldham talked about, I think at the universities, they are our future. The students there are our future. And like Andy, I'm troubled by the misunderstandings there. But in order, we both, and a lot of us up here, go on these campuses on a weekly, monthly, sometimes daily basis and talk to the students. And we needed to understand the accusations about genocide. And so before I went, I studied a little bit about what the accusations were. I looked up what the United Nations described as genocide, and here's as every lawyer in this room will understand, I cared what the text said. And it said it's the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethical, racial, or religious group. The key words there are intent, to destroy a particular ethnical or religious group in this case. And what I found is if that accusation was the one they were trying to prove, Israel was historically bad at accomplishing that task. I mean, it's easy to think of genocide in the past. I mean, all we have to do is think about the Nazis killing the Jews in the Holocaust simply because they were Jews. Or the Hutus slaughtering the Tutsis in the Rwandan genocide because they were Tutsi. For it to be genocide, it has to be a specific and deliberate aim to bring about the destruction of the group. So if that's your goal, why would you drop leaflets and tell people to move? Why would you set up safe zones? Why would you send texts and warn them? That's some of the things Israel does that no other country has done before. So I went to Israel to ask the hard questions of the Israelis. And Judge Altman, I told him that's what I wanted to do. He took me to the generals with a group of judges that's good at asking questions. And we asked the hard questions. And what we saw is from the purely objective evidence, this is the furthest thing from a genocide possible. In fact, if this is a genocide, every war in the history is a genocide of multiple proportions of what's gone on in Israel. They know they can't prove the intent, so what do they look to? They look to the other things of objective evidence: civilian deaths, damaged infrastructure, and humanitarian needs. But that, we know, isn't how international law works. I gave you the description. But even if it was, let's talk about that. Why is there damage? Is there any debate that Hamas created a vast array of tunnels underneath Gaza and deliberately placed weapons and fighters in homes, schools, hospitals, and mosques? Who's to blame for the civilian deaths? America, Israel, other humanitarian civilized nations, yes, I said civilized nations, put the children and the women who aren't fighters and the men who aren't fighters in the tunnels and fight from above. Hamas did the opposite. Make no mistake, Hamas used human shields. And now, think about that, and then look at what leading urban warfare expert John Spencer has said. He said Israel set a new standard for war by texting and calling the civilian populations to warn them of attacks, by moving them, and by using something known as roof knocking, where they would drop low-yield devices to warn of the upcoming attacks. But we still met with the generals. We knew all this. We still met with the generals, and we pushed them. And so they showed us how lawyers would call off attacks because in the distance they saw a child when they wanted to hit a high-value target. Now, my roommate and dear friend and one of my closest friends in the world from college is a general in the United States military. And if I told him what to do, as much as he loves me, he might pull out his sidearm. But that's what happens in Israel. The lawyers and judges call off attacks. And so John Spencer studied the statistics, and here's what he found. The civilian to combat death ratio for Gaza is 1-to-1 or 2-to-1, which is better than any other modern warfare. And I'll give you a few examples. In 2016, 2017, in the Battle of Mosul, America-led Iraqi security force killed 10,000 civilians to get 4,000 ISIS. That's 2.5 to 1. In 1945, Battle of Manila, which had similar fighting conditions to Gaza, the American military killed 100,000 civilians to kill 17,000 Japanese soldiers. That's 6 to 1. Israel restraint on the battlefield proves that any suggestion of genocidal intent is absolutely crazy. Would the Nazis or Hutus have taken any measures whatsoever to save the lives of those they sought to exterminate? To ask the question answers it. And Israel goes one step further, and we saw it firsthand. They have facilitated a large volume of humanitarian assistance. They delivered over 2 million tons of aid to Gaza, provided more than 2 million vaccinations, supplied 14 million liters of water a day, supported hospitals, and transported over 36,000 people for medical treatment. No other military in the history of the world has waged war while simultaneously providing this level of aid to the enemy's civilian population. The genocide label matters. It's being used by anti-Semites to equate modern Israel with Nazi Germany. It's being used, as my friend Judge Oldham said, to harass Jewish students in America on campus. Think about that. They have nothing to do with it. Even if Israel was doing something wrong, they have nothing to do with it. And for any of us that don't stand up to that type of harassment and that type of religious intoleration, shame on us. So, if genocide, a word that was coined only in the 1940s, in the midst of what? The Holocaust, is to retain its status as a uniquely horrific crime, then we simply can't, shouldn't, and must not use that term when we talk about Israel's war in Gaza. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge Capone. Judge Nelson, you're also a member of a historically persecuted religious minority in America. And by the way, in Miami, we like to say we're the most Zionist community in America, but then Ryan took me to Utah, you know, and I don't know that I mean, their bank is called the Zion's Bank. And I was amazed by the kids that I met and spending time with your son and going to dinner afterwards and just getting to talk to the young people there, so different than other colleges I've been to, where the young kids really saw themselves as being part of a little mini Israel within America, where 18-year-olds go to serve a mission that's greater than themselves, just like in Israel, 18-year-olds go to fight and die for their country. So talk to us a little bit about the LDS community and the LDS community's special relationship with Jews and with Israel, and whether that was one of the impetuses for you coming on our trip.
Yeah, well, thank you. It's great to be here. We were, a group of judges who have all taken an oath to support and defend the Constitution. We talk about that a lot, and this is a really unique opportunity to talk about other oaths and other commitments that we've taken that will outlive the oaths that we've taken. President can only appoint us to life unless you're on the Ninth Circuit, and we had one that tried to go a little further and got shot down. But the oaths and the commitments that we're talking about today are ones that will outlive and go with us beyond this life. And so you asked about the LDS faith, and it is something. We believe that that Israel and the Jewish people are a covenant people. And I love that idea because it's sort of ingrained within American history as well. Benjamin, the founders and even the pilgrims that came over viewed themselves as, following in Moses' footsteps of leading the people away. And they hearkened back to this great Judeo-Christian tradition. And Benjamin Franklin, wanted to put Moses, leading his people out through the Red Sea on the seal. And we, as an LDS faith, have sort of, we empathize with what, the Jews have gone through. I mean, obviously it hasn't been as harsh, but we were run out. I mean, we basically had to leave the United States, after we got there because we started out in Kirkland, Ohio. We were run out of there. We went to Missouri and set up another a gathering place, and the governor adopted an extermination order, said it was actually for the good of the people that the Mormons would either be run out or killed. That lasted for 140 years. That was never actually abolished until just, 30 years ago. Basically.
1978,
yeah.
I think.
So, and then we went to Nauvoo and set up another community there, and that's where Joseph Smith was killed, assassinated, lynched, as a great Jewish scholar called it. And that's when they fled and they said, we got to leave the United States, and went to Utah. But it didn't get a lot better. Federal troops came in from Utah to, put down what they perceived to be a Mormon rebellion. My home state, Idaho, the Constitution disenfranchised LDS voters, and that lasted for a long time. We did not, even though we are a pretty strong plurality in Idaho, we didn't have a statewide elected LDS official until Larry Echohawk as Attorney General in the 80s, and Senator Crapo is still the first U.S. senator that's LDS that's been elected. So these persecutions, what one religious scholar called a formal, legal, and institutional oppression, have lasted, and they aren't gone. I mean, look, you came. When we came.
Don't ever drive in a car with Ryan Nelson.
I got you there safely.
He's like the LDS Mario Andrade.
Jake Retzloff was the BYU quarterback. There's two Jewish quarterbacks for the NCAA I know, Jake Retzloff and Roy Altman.
He was almost as good as me.
Yeah. So I said, we got to get them in the same room together, and we did. We went over to the BYU practice squad, and Jake took some time, and I watched two Jewish quarterbacks talk about their experience. And Jake's comment was very interesting. As a Jew, one of maybe 3 or 4 Jews at an LDS institution, and he said, but I empathize. He said, when I go and travel with the team, every away game we go to, the chants by the visiting crowds are F the Mormons. And this is going on. This prejudice against religion is still happening today. And the Colorado game a couple weeks ago, in fact, the NCAA fined University of Colorado for these. And Deion Sanders, great man, religious man, condemned his own students for it and said, yeah, but they're probably drunk or on other addictive substances. So we've got to get past this in some way. I mean, it happened. We had the Michigan example where an LDS congregation was meeting and worshiping, and somebody who hated the LDS faith drove a truck in there, shot many of them, and burned the church down. So these things are happening, and in the olden days, we could all talk about our religious differences and debate those things. Those are great debates to have, but there's a great evil that we have had to combine against, and I'm grateful for the solidarity that I have with my Jewish friends, with my other Christian friends, and I'm honored to be a part of this.
Thank you, Ryan.
Process.
Jake they had just beaten Utah, which all you need to know for this story is that they wear red uniforms, and it was at Utah, the whole crowd was red, and he had marched the football team down the field with 2 minutes left and won the game, and he showed me on his phone the Provo newspaper the next day said, the headline was, this is an amazing headline, for the first time in 2,000 years, a Jewish man leads his people across a Red Sea. Judge Strauss, Judge Rudofsky was kind enough to invite us both to Arkansas to speak at the Federalist Society conference there. And honestly, I thought I was going to be the star of the show, and I was a little bit disappointed to find out that you were the star. But you spoke about your grandfather, what he went through, and why the Holocaust is so personal to you as a federal judge and lawyer in America, as someone who upholds the freedom of speech, and why the First Amendment as a bedrock principle of our democracy and our civilization means so much to you, given the stifling of speech and dissent and tolerance that your grandfather went through. And I wonder if you could share some of those thoughts with our audience today.
Thank you, Roy. And before I start, I just want to thank everybody on this panel for standing up here with us and talking about this difficult issue, to Roy for helping, and Lee for helping to put together the panel, to the Bork family for sponsoring it. I'm not sure at the end of the speech I'm going to be able to really thank everyone, so I wanted to do it right on the front end. This is a very, very personal thing for me, and it has been for a long time. I grew up spending my summers with my grandparents in Kansas City, and they were Holocaust survivors. My grandfather was in a wheelchair, had multiple sclerosis, and my grandmother had terrible emotional scars from her time in the Holocaust. She talked about eating moldy bread. She talked about being whipped with a belt with a spike at the end of it, which tore her eyelid. It really is personal. I felt like I sort of grew up with this. And actually, the timing of this panel is sort of fortuitous because we have an anniversary coming up, not a great anniversary, but the anniversary of Kristallnacht, the Night of the Broken Glass. And my grandparents talked about that, particularly my grandfather. He said Jewish businesses were being looted, people were being taken off the streets. He experienced it because he was in school, and in school, they pulled him out of school, and the principal said to him, "You're going home now." And he asked why, and they said, "Because this is really bad." And when he got home, he figured out how bad it really was. So seeing the rise of anti-Semitism again has been personally disappointing for me. And it reminds me a lot, some of the things that are happening remind me a lot of my grandparents' story in little ways. And what it teaches me is that anti-Semitism starts really small. All religious discrimination starts really small, and then it gets bigger. So I'll talk about a couple of things that happened to my grandparents. So one thing that happened to them was they were regularly called, and I'll quote this, "damn Jews." That's what were written on businesses, that's what were written on schools. We just had in Minneapolis, not my shul, but another shul had anti-Semitic graffiti painted on it. And frankly, that's not all that much different than some of the stray comments that I get in the skyways as I move between buildings in downtown Minneapolis. Another thing that happened is they couldn't pray together, right? They couldn't exercise their religion together. Sometimes in small ways, it reminds me of going to High Holy Days this year and seeing, multiple police vehicles out front. Why? Because bomb threats get phoned in during the high holidays. There's threats against people who are in the building. And that reminds me about my grandparents. At least we were able to pray together, but it reminds me sort of what my grandparents went through. Now, bringing it back to the First Amendment, one of the most hard stories for me to deal with was very early on. This was before Kristallnacht. My grandfather was trying to send mail. And because he was trying to send mail, this goes directly to free speech and religious liberty, they pulled him into the Gestapo building and questioned him. He was trying to send mail outside the country. And they said, "What is this all about? Why are you sending this mail?" And eventually he made it out of the building. But that story has reminded me how so incredibly important free speech is. The simple act of sending mail is what got my grandparents or my grandfather almost imprisoned. But it's sort of a story of hope too. When I went to Arkansas and other places, I talked about the hope. A great source of that hope is all the people in this room and all the people throughout the nation who feel so strongly and stand for religious liberty and freedom of speech. My grandparents experienced that, probably in much bigger ways than I have. For example, my grandfather became sick, very sick in the Holocaust, in the camp, and he was malnourished, and he was placed in a German hospital within the camp, and nurses saved his life. He was too weak to work, and if you're too weak to work, you were sent to the gas chamber after a certain number of weeks, so they moved him from room to room without telling any of the doctors and saved his life, and eventually he became better and got out of the hospital. But for the grace of God, I would not be here, but for those nurses. My grandfather hatched an escape plan with other prisoners in the camps. He knew he wasn't Polish speaking, so he couldn't survive outside the walls. And so what ended up happening is they were going to have the camp electrician, who was a prisoner, short out the electric fence. And he told the guards what was happening. And 3 of my grandfather's dear friends were hung on the gallows in the middle of a roll call the next morning. They did not admit my grandfather's involvement. My grandfather helped them, but they kept his identity confidential. And for his troubles, he got to bring down his 3 great friends from the gallows that morning in the concentration camp. But the source of hope there is people are inherently good, and those 3 friends of his saved his life. These are the things that give me hope, and I've been comforted. Senator Cruz has been an avid advocate for against anti-Semitism, and I appreciate what he said. Senator McConnell has been an advocate against anti-Semitism as well. But where I want to end is on some hope, which is a part of the speech that I give that is my grandfather's words. I was transported in a freight car, unknowing my destination, to Auschwitz. I was then taken on an open truck to Auschwitz-Buna, the IG Farben chemical complex, which was part of the camp. I remember being stripped naked of civilian cloth, running through a cold April rain. I remember shivering not only from the cold, but also from the fear of what would happen next. A prisoner tattooing the number 117022 on my left forearm. Suddenly, I didn't have a name anymore. I was just a number. But even with no name, I still knew who I was. I still had my identity. I still knew about my upbringing and my roots. I was so young, just a teenager. Already in my young years, I had experienced a life that most people never experience in a lifetime, much less survive. At that time, I could not comprehend that I would die. I probably didn't even understand what death meant because I was just so young. I had not lived enough. I had survived. Liberation, what did it mean to us? You try to find members of your family, they're not coming back. You immigrate to new and other countries, new surroundings, new language, new customs. You find a job, you work hard, you support yourself and your new family. You get accustomed to your new country, a free human being. Suddenly, your thoughts come back to a time when you were subjected to inhuman treatment. The joy of liberation and freedom somehow gets lost with the inner feelings. Something is wrong with me. You question yourself, why did I survive? Why? All of a sudden, life is a struggle again. Who can you complain to? Maybe no one wants to believe that we are suffering from the after effects of the Holocaust. Some people believe us, but not the ones that are responsible for it. Right now, we are still fighting them for the damage done to us, for our rights. I am speaking the facts and truths for many survivors. We, the survivors, have to let the world know that we will never again allow another Holocaust. All of you here in this room, may I call you my friends. We must speak up and let the world know that we are proud of our heritage. Now, that was my grandparents' fight, and now we're in a new period of anti-Semitism, and now it's my fight, and I intend to take up the fight.
Thank you, Judge. Last night, last but not least, my good friend Lisa Branch. Last night, Judge Tapar talked about what happened at NYU on October the 7th of this year when Ilya Shapiro was canceled from campus. And Sheldon called me and told me about it and said, would you come up and we'll do an event across the street with Ilya. And I said, well, I'd like Lisa to come too. And so I called Lisa Branch and I said, would you come up there with me? And she said, I will always stand by you if you need me. And we came up, and I think Ilya asked her at the very beginning, once NYU had caved and we did it back at NYU, why are you here? Why'd you come? And Lisa, you gave an answer that I'll never forget and that I just think is so powerful and makes me so grateful to call you my friend. And I was hoping that you could share that answer with our audience before we close.
Thank you. Thank you to the Federalist Society and the Bork family for honoring all of us with the opportunity to participate on what has really truly been such a special panel. And thank you to Judge Altman for not only herding the cats of this panel, which is, I think, the largest panel I've ever seen, but for organizing all of the judges' trips to Israel. He's a constant presence on these trips. When we talk about the judges' trips, it's not just one. He goes on so many of them, and he makes all of the trips so special for us. But also, thank you for being my dear friend.
Thank you, Lisa.
Judge Strauss said the words of his grandfather, "Never again." That was the promise the world made to the Jews after the Holocaust. The promise did not hold. At first, the erosion was subtle. Anti-Semitism crept back in on little cat feet. In fact, a lot of us, myself included, did not even notice. Then came the horror of the October 7th massacre, just a little more than 2 years ago, when images of the brutal terrorist attack orchestrated by Hamas on innocent civilians started circulating. I immediately thought of the Holocaust. How in the world could such an unforgivable atrocity be happening again? I truly never thought that I would see in my lifetime Jews rounded up and slaughtered. I was reminded yet again never to underestimate man's capacity for evil. I watched the live stream videos in horror as Hamas terrorists butchered babies, raped women, chased and gunned down those attending a music festival, burned families alive, and shot elderly people at point-blank range in front of their families. Hamas murdered almost 1,200 innocent souls that day and kidnapped at least 240. I wept often, overwhelmed by the savagery. On October 8th, I admit that I expected that the world would come together and unite against the evil, much as we did on September 12th, 2001. I was shocked and outraged to find out how quickly I was so very wrong. Anti-Semitism, once lurking but hidden, is now on full display. We saw protesters in many cities wearing keffiyeh, the black and white scarf popularized by the father of modern terrorism, Yasser Arafat, painting their hands red, a mockery of 2 Israel Defense Force soldiers murdered and mutilated by the PLO, while chanting "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," which comes from Hamas's charter, calling for the destruction of the Jewish state and the genocide of the Jews from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. On college campuses, protesting students stormed campus buildings, damaging property, while terrified Jewish classmates barricaded themselves in classrooms and libraries. On podcasts and on YouTube videos, we've heard the disgusting comments directed at Jews. Others are more subtle, disguising their hate behind sophisticated criticisms. And the criticisms come not only from those lined up against us, but sometimes from those among us. Overwhelmed by horror, grief, and anger, what could I, as a Christian, do? What was I obligated by my faith to do? I realized I needed to take a more active stance against anti-Semitism. Recently, my mother remarked that throughout my life, I had always stood beside my Jewish friends. I told my mom that post-October 7th, it was now time for me to stand in front of them. When I watched my Jewish friends reacting in fear to October 7th and holding each other tight, I realized they thought Jews were standing alone. I needed to demonstrate they are not. First, I reached out to my Jewish friends. I apologized for not understanding the true depth of anti-Semitism they face in our country. I remember starting in law school in the early 1990s, a Jewish friend complained about anti-Semitism. I am ashamed to admit that I thought he was exaggerating. I thought I would have noticed if it existed. I was wrong. I missed it at the time, but no one can miss it now. I also called and texted my Jewish friends to see how they were dealing with October 7th. The answer is, not well. I knew they would be upset, but I had no appreciation for the depth of their despair until I spoke to them. After that, I pledged to check in often. I highly recommend you do the same. Second, I went to Israel for the first time. I had always wanted to go, but safety concerns had stopped me. I realized there would always be an excuse, and it was time to go. To perhaps underline this point, as my group was planning to travel there, Israel executed a targeted attack on Hezbollah using exploding pagers. As you can imagine, tensions skyrocketed. Family and friends urged me not to go. I went first to Jerusalem and then to Tel Aviv. We did shelter in place twice when the missile alerts sounded, but 10 minutes later, life resumed. It was important for me to be there, to meet Israelis, to understand life and government in Israel, and to come face to face with the physical, emotional, and psychological aftermath of October 7th. We visited the kibbutzes that had been invaded by Hamas, as well as the memorial site for the music festival massacre. Near Gaza, I experienced palpable fear as I saw the gate the terrorist had cut to enter Israel. We spoke at length with a woman whose husband was, at that time, a hostage and shared our prayers for her family. Thankfully, her husband was freed when the last of the hostages were returned. We met with government leaders to learn about Israel and how carefully it approaches war. The trip allowed me to show my support for Jews, but it also taught me about their resilience and resolve. They are fighting a battle against people who hate them simply for being Jews. They are doing so with or without us. It's time to make our positions in this battle clear. Third, I started speaking out against anti-Semitism on law school campuses. In April of 2024, about 6 months after October 7th, I spoke at a Harvard Law Federalist Society event advising students about the hate-filled meaning behind their protest symbols and chants. In January of this year, I traveled to a law school in Canada to discuss anti-Semitism on campus and faced a screaming, keffiyeh-clad protester trying to disrupt my remarks. She wasn't successful because the other students shouted her down. It also helped that the Royal Canadian Mounted Police were guarding the room. Most recently, as we've heard about last night and today, I joined Judge Altman, Ilya Shapiro, and Nadine Strassen at NYU on this October 7th, the 2-year anniversary, to ensure that Ilya's talk would go forward as originally scheduled. And now I am here today. As I told Judge Altman before our NYU event and before our event today, when he asks if I will do an event about October 7th, my response will always be, where do you need me to be? Let me close with a quote that captures the battle we are facing against anti-Semitism. I was fortunate to be in the room when Bari Weiss delivered the Olson Memorial Lecture in front of this crowd in November of 2023, a little over a month after the October 7th attacks. She said, "We have let far too much go unchallenged. Too many lies have spread in the face of inaction as a result of fear and politesse. No more. Do not bite your tongue. Do not tremble. Do not go along with little lies. Speak up. Break the wall of lies. Let nothing go unchallenged. There is no Calvary coming. We are the Calvary. We are the last line of defense. Our civilization depends on us." I agree with Bari. Thank you.